Good afternoon to everybody and welcome to this afternoon meeting. I bring you greetings by our Dean, Professor Claudio Vela, and I wish everybody great work. So it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to open. It's a pleasure and also the honor to open this afternoon discussion and give a warm welcome to Georgia Coward, Michael Bashler, Giovanni Giuriati, and I would also to thank Massimiliano Guido, our professor that organized this meeting, but also a very stimulating schedule for our graduate students, that it's Seminario di Musicologia. There is also another person to thank and welcome, that it's Ofer Gazit, who gave many lessons and lectures and interesting meetings to this week. That were very stimulating for our graduate students and also our colleagues. So I will give the floor to Professor Massimiliano Guido in order to start our afternoon work.
Thank you, Ingrid. Ingrid is the Vice Dean of our department, so she's the official person for get this afternoon started. Welcome, everybody. Buongiorno, good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone. It's a great pleasure for us to host Georgia Coward and Michael Bachler from United States, respectively president of the elect of the American Musicology Society and president of the Society for Music Theory. We have also the pleasure of having Giovanni Giuriati, and who is president of the ADUIM, Association of Docenti, teachers or professor of at the University of Musicology in Italy, something like that. I know it doesn't translate good, but acronyms are always difficult. Thanks also to the colleagues of my faculty who are here physically, Peter Zappalà and Ingrid, and Gianmario Borio, Daniele Sabaino, Donatella Mellini, that are on Zoom with us. So this is the ending of a quite stimulating musicology seminar that we offer to our graduate students, and the provoking title was "Where Are We Going?" On the current state of musicologies. We believe that we cannot talk anymore about only a way of doing musicology, only a way of doing with our research field. The world is changing, maybe not for good, but we are all living into a globalized environment that has many and contrasting challenges. So it's also good to think about musicologies as a plural and ask ourselves, where are we going, and what do we think is the most important thing to carry on in a new way of dealing with the discipline. So with no further ado, I let our American friends the floor so that they can briefly introduce themselves. We discussed how to carry on this seminar, and we decided for a more informal presentation. So instead of reading their distinguished and stellar CV, I let them say something about who they are and why they are doing this service to the profession. That is a very important aspect in that is really linking our communities. So, Georgia, thanks a lot for being here, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Max. I am a professor of musicology at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. We call it Case here. And I, as Max has told you, I'm president-elect of the American Musicological Society, AMS. Personally, I work on the cultural history of music and the arts in 17th and 18th century France. I work on opera, arts, and politics under Louis XIV, and I'm currently working on a group of subversive artists who encoded a protest of the king in their works, in operas, opera ballets, and in some of the visual art of the time.
Thank you. And now, Michael.
Sure. Hi, I'm Michael Buckler. I teach at Florida State University in Tallahassee. That's in the middle of the long connected part of Florida. Not that it's all connected, but the what we call the Panhandle. I'm currently actually in New Orleans, helping to organize the big joint meeting that we're going to have in November, the American Musicological Society, Society for Music Theory, which I'm president of, and Society for Ethnomusicology. I'm a professor of music theory. I also work on political music. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but my focus has shifted toward musical theater, and I've been working recently on like agitprop and political musical theater, especially as related to depictions of workers and unions. I'm also very active in our faculty union at Florida State University. So that's probably enough about me.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Giovanni, would you like to say something about yourself as well?
Yes, if you wish. I'm a full professor at the University of Rome La Sapienza, and I'm directing the Institute for Intercultural Music Studies at the Fondazione Scini in Venice. My field is ethnomusicology. I'm dealing with the music of Southeast Asia and the music of Southern Italy. Of course, I'm also interested in some theoretical issues, like, for instance, study on performance and on music improvisation, and I'm keen to do work on interdisciplinary fields. I guess that's enough.
Yeah, that's plenty. Ofer, it's your turn.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Ofer Gazit. I'm a lecturer in music. I would say that at Tel Aviv University, Bookman Mena School of Music, where I teach things related to jazz, history of music, analysis, and research method in ethnomusicology. And my research interests involve jazz and migration, or migration in relation to the Americas and the Caribbean. And I think that'll be enough for me. Thank you.
No? Okay, so I guess it's my turn. I'm Massimiliano Guido. I deal with organology and history of music theory. Also crossed the pond and spent a couple of years at McGill University dealing with music theory and improvisation at the keyboard. So I guess we are a very good panel because our research interests are so wide, and we bring diversity all together. And if we combine our perspectives, I'm confident that this afternoon will be quite entertaining in a way, but also informative. Let's have some order in this talk. So the students prepared a couple of articles that you assigned. Philip Ewell, groundbreaking and shaking, really, assertion about music theory and the state of art in the field, and how these racial perspectives are damaging or influencing the study of music and the study of the history of theories and so on, and two other articles. But first, I think it's good to let our key lecturers to have a presentation of what they think is happening in their own societies and in their own environment. So thank you again, Georgia, for making this, and I give you the mic and floor.
Okay, and I am sharing my screen. Please let me know if you can or cannot see it. Are we good there?
Yes?
Great. So I'll go back to the beginning. The AMS and New Trends in American Musicology. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. This is something that we have begun to do in the AMS, and I am speaking to you from Cleveland, so I will recognize the land from which I speak. And in doing that, I express my gratitude and appreciation to those who lived and worked here before us, those whose stewardship and resilient spirit makes our residence possible on this traditional homeland of the Erie, Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. I acknowledge their spiritual connection with this land and its waters, and I acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. So the AMS was founded in 1934 as a white male society dedicated to the study of a traditional European canon. Until recently, it has been considered and has been a very conservative society, and new ideas have been met with resistance. That is beginning to change. There have been progressive directions following fields of literature, anthropology, cultural history, and other fields since the 1990s mainly. And new trends have been brought about by a progressive board of directors, a line of progressive presidents and other officers, and a new executive director that we've had for a few years. The AMS committees on race and gender, I'll speak about just briefly in a moment, as agents of change. And the study groups, these are groups that meet in the evenings at our AMS meetings. The study groups are the site of a lot of energy in the society and a lot of new ideas and change. So a lot of the new directions have been created by the study groups. The Journal of the American Musicological Society, JAMS, is changing year by year. I'm sure you have noticed if you have been following it, and I'll speak about that briefly in a moment as well. A new blog, fairly new blog that we have in the society called Musicology Now. I really encourage all of you to take a look at it. It really is about musicology in this moment. There are two superb articles on musicians in the Ukraine and the fate of pianos left behind by people who have left Ukraine. Also, some very incisive articles on race and the many other directions that we'll be talking about today. So that blog is very much a reflection of these new trends. The paper sessions at AMS have been changing as well. The daytime sessions are more in the line of traditional musicology, but they have changed from within quite a bit and now incorporate a lot of the methodologies and the ideas that we'll be speaking about today. So the new directions that we're talking about really go back to the new musicology of the 1980s and 90s. The new musicology sought to bring cultural studies more fully into alignment with musical analysis and criticism. They question and move away from a musical canon, and they celebrate difference in all its forms. Some of the practitioners are Susan McClary, Lawrence Kramer, and Gary Tomlinson. I'm sure you are all aware of the rise of critical race studies in the last few years, and perhaps you're not aware of the issue of race as it has been confronted in the American Musicological Society, and of course, Michael will speak to that, and Giovanni in the other societies. Really, the society for our society has, up until 1992, it has been very much, almost exclusively devoted to European music. And after Susan McClary's book, Feminine Endings, there was a lot of talk and a lot of thought about how to diversify the AMS. So in the year 1992, the year after her book appeared, two committees were formed in the AMS that have been very active ever since: the AMS Committee on Cultural Diversity and the AMS Committee on Women and Gender. There's an article in Musicology now by Carol Oja, who was one of the founders of the Committee on Cultural Diversity. And I had not realized until I read this article, but I did remember how hot the debate was in the early 90s and has continued ever since. And now we're seeing certainly that debate spill over into the Society for Music Theory. The Committee on Cultural Diversity was voted down by the AMS board when it was first introduced as a possibility to have this committee. It was later, a vote was taken again. It was supposedly voted down on a technicality. Professor Oja believes that it was more than that, and but it was instated in 1992, and it has been concerned with, it was originally called the Committee on Minorities. As you can imagine, that's old-fashioned terminology now. The Committee on Cultural Diversity now is mainly occupied with our Eileen Southern Awards, which are travel awards for underrepresented minorities to travel to the AMS. Critical race theory arose out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. The term was coined in 1989 as an application of literary and later music criticism to issues of race. In 2017, I was on the board of the AMS at that time, and we became aware that there had been some instances of bias that members were beginning to complain about. And the president of the society at that time committed another committee. And this one was originally called the Committee on Race and Ethnicity. It's now had indigeneity added to the title just a few months ago, actually. So that committee was very active. Judith Tsao was a member, and Judy created a Critical Race Studies Award in 2018, and that award is given each year. And there also was created an AMS endowed annual lecturer on critical race studies in that same year. The Journal of the American Musicological Society, again, known as a rather conservative journal, has certainly begun to incorporate critical race theory. The issue from 2019 includes articles by Matthew Morrison and Braxton Shelley. Morrison's article on Black sound growing out of blackface and influencing commercial music from that time to this. Braxton Shelley's Analyzing Gospel. He's a young scholar at Yale, and he is beginning to really look at this music in an analytical way, but from a musicologist's point of view. And both of those articles have remained on the JAM's most read list till now. I mentioned earlier the Committee on Women and Gender, founded in 1992, and that committee helped to shape a feminist musicology growing out of McClary's work by applying feminist theory and by continuing work that had already begun before that, but had not been fully recognized on women and music and women in music. So I just wanted to show you, I don't know whether you can all see, if you can move the pictures of us around a little bit, the study groups of the AMS. As I said, these meet in the evening. It has been a place where groups that have felt marginalized could bring forth their new work. And this has really influenced the society and brought into the society ideas and research that has enriched the society. We can just look briefly at the numbers here. You can see the Global Music History Study Group, the fourth one down, is by far the largest at 467, and it was just created in 2019. So that reflects this really strong interest in musicologists to look at music history in a global manner. And here, as in so many areas, we're seeing a meeting of musicology and ethnomusicology, and that might be something we would want to talk about in the discussion. The Global East Asian Music Research Study Group has just been created recently and is beginning to grow rapidly. There's the Ecomusicology Study Group, History of Music Theory. The Ibero-American Music Study Group, I'll talk about these later, but just wanted you to see what they were as a whole. The Ludomusicology Study Group, looking at video games. LGBTQ, one of the most active groups, 284 members. Music and disability, 167. Music and media, film and new media, 336. Music and philosophy, looking, I would say, aesthetics and other connections of philosophy with music, 358. These next three are brand new, only came into being a couple of months ago. Music, sound, and trauma, music notation, inscription and visualization, looking at digital visualization, and music notation in other cultures, not just in Western early music. The organology study group is looking at the study of musical instruments. Pedagogy study group is very dynamic and is involved with bringing these new methodologies and new areas of study into pedagogy. The popular music study group has 421 members. It's also very dynamic. And skills and resources for early music study groups. So you see there are some earlier period groups. You don't see groups dedicated to certain centuries, do you? That is a big change from the way the society has been organized in the past. So looking at popular music, the Society for American Music separated from AMS in 1975 and felt that they did not have a voice in the society. Since they have separated, the society has been much more devoted to American popular music and popular music of all forms. And I'm sorry, I think this is a mistake. That group is called Popular Music Study Group. It's not just American, but of course it is more focused on American pop music. The focus areas are hip hop, K-pop, mandopop, jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. And I would like to shout out to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, here where I live, in a beautiful location on Lake Erie. The AMS has collaborated with the Rock Hall by bringing lectures by AMS members on rock and roll, and any AMS member can apply to give the lecture, and there's been series of lectures. These have been remote in the last few years, but hopefully they will go live soon. Another study group that there's a lot of buzz around these days is the Music and Disability Study Group. And as Michael knows, it has been very collaborative with S&T study group. This discipline really began with a panel at the 2004 AMS meeting. And after that meeting, Neil Lerner and Joseph Strauss published essays in this book, Sounding Off, Theorizing Disability in Music. And the discipline involves disabled music makers, disability and reception, such as Beethoven's The Heroic Overcomer, as he is known, and representations of disability, for example, in the opera Rigoletto. Growing out of the disability group, and of course, again, musicology follows literary studies, and especially English, which has been very forward-looking in many cases, creating fields on which have been applied to music by musicologists. It's been interesting to me. I have served as interim chair of the English department for the last 2 years, and as a service to the College of Arts and Sciences at Case. And it's been really interesting to see how all of these areas have been mainstreamed even more in English than they have in musicology. In fact, English is giving up altogether its structure around centuries and is looking at subdisciplines like we're talking about today to organize its curriculum. They're doing a complete overhaul of their curriculum, and we're beginning to do that in musicology too. For one thing, faculty lines have been cut so severely that we can't cover all the centuries like we used to. I don't know whether that's happening in Italy, but it would be interesting to talk about the effect that's having on our curricula. Anyway, so an ethics of care grows out of the disability group, and this really came to prominence in at the 2021 meeting a few months ago in a session called Musicology in the Pandemic, Precarity, Care, and Equity. How our situation is perceived as so precarious, and how that forces us to think in terms of care and equity in a way that we haven't in the past. And the leader in this subdiscipline has been Will Ching with his book, Just Vibrations of 2016, which Joseph Strauss called a passionate and personal plea for a reparative musicology for a field that favors empathy, compassion, and care. And Loving Music Till It Hurts, which came out in 2020, Music and Social Justice, which asks questions like, how can we admire conductors who have committed sexual aggressions against young people, and difficult questions like that. The AMS LGBTQ study group posits as its mission, as you see underlined here, an increasing awareness of sexuality and music in the academy, promoting contact among music scholars working in LGBTQ studies, and establishing a forum for the presentation of such research. Also, to provide an environment in which to examine the process of coming out in academia, and to contribute to a positive political climate for affirmative action and LGBTQ curricula. The interests of the LGBTQ study group focus on performance, aesthetics, and reception, and those interests are more prominent really across the board than interests in classical composers anymore. And for some reason, with the exception of Pauline Oliveros, who is attracting a lot of attention at this time. There's a strong interest in transgender musicians, especially in popular music, and intersections with race, feminist studies, Black feminisms in North America and the Caribbean. And you'll see this term intersections again and again in all these subdisciplines because the boundaries are breaking down between these fields. And there's just a lot of overlap here. The LGBTQ study group has an event each year at AMS, and here's some of the titles of their most recent events. Still Here, Still Queer, celebrating 3 decades of LGBTQ scholarship at AMS. This field is increasingly becoming known as queer scholarship, which embraces LGBT and under the umbrella of Q, queer, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer. 2018, new LGBTQ music scholarship. 2017, queering dance musics. 2016, racing queer music scholarship, which is a play on the term queering scholarship, which has been used a lot to indicate a stretching of what what are the norms in that scholarship. So it's turned around here, and racing is bringing race to the stretching of those norms and to LGBTQ scholarship. In 2015, a serious effort not to think straight, a conversation with Suzanne Cusick. And yeah, so we moved to another study group, the AMS Music and Media Study Group, film music, television, music video, Twitter, digital technologies, video art, music, and the internet are some of the interests of this group. And of course, film music has been around for a longer time. The new media is more and more an interest. And the new media embraces ludomusicology, which is the study of music for video games. That study group, it's beginning, I think, to kind of merge with the music and media study group. There seems to be more energy in this group than the other. The Ecomusicology study group, the term ecomusicology arose in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, to mean the study of music, nature, and the environment. Again, it straddles the fields of musicology and ethnomusicology. There hasn't been quite as much going on in the field of ecomusicology after some very promising and exciting publications around 2015 and 2016. But there is planned a session for AMS in November of 2022 called Music, Sound, and Environmental Justice. And I'll just let you glance at the questions that the call for paper asks, asking for submissions of papers on these topics. The AMS Global Music History Study Group was founded in 2019, and it was inspired by a couple of books, What is Global History from 2016 and Studies on a Global History of Music in 2018 by Reinhard Strom. Again, you see the intersection of musicology and ethnomusicology, and of course, the very intensely watched studies of cultural mobility, human mobility, migration, and music on the move. The Global East Asian Study Group, as I said before, I really didn't know much about what was happening with this group, but I communicated with Kunio Hara, who is a friend of mine and co-chair of the group, and he tells me that there is an increased interest in exploring the history of Western art music in East Asia and its Asian practitioners. And especially in the US, there is a hunger to know more about Asian composers and living in this country. Again, he tells me, everyone that I speak to tells me that the boundaries are breaking down between musicology and ethnomusicology. I mentioned the Ibero-American Music Study Group. This is involved with music from Spain, Latin America, and Latinx population of US. And right now there is an increasing emphasis on Latinx musics of the Americas. Other vital areas since 1980, music and politics, music and the body, opera and representation, performance, reception, aesthetics, and voice studies. And I won't read these, but this list is a list of books that have been published by members of the AMS and supported by AMS subventions, which anyone in the AMS can apply for. And you can just see the wide variety in methodologies in in these books, which is just kind of a cross section of what's happening in our field in the US.
So, thank you very much, Georgia, for this enlightening talk.
I'll just leave, Max, I'll just leave this up here for a moment.
Sure.
These are the top grad recruits. This is my last slide.
Oh, sorry,
This is
I thought you were gone. Sorry, my apologies.
oh, no. This is the students that were our top 10 or 12 for the past 2 years. And asterisk by the field indicates that we offered them a position and were accepted. They were accepted to our graduate program. And so you can just see music business, film music, ecomusicology, Pauline Oliveros, medieval interdisciplinary studies, pop music, Broadway musicals, voice studies, and queer musicology. That one we wanted but did not come because there's a program at UCLA that specializes in that, which we lost that student to. Sibelius, the orchestra in 2022, music and race, and hip hop. This is our first hip hop student. So we're scrambling to be able to accommodate all of these different disciplines. So that's where we stand, and I'll leave it there for Michael to pick up on the Society for Music Theory, I think is next. Is that right?
Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot. So, Michael, it's your turn if you're ready to share.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'll share, I have some slides that I'll share a little bit later. I just thought I would talk to you all first. It occurs to me to say just a wee bit more about my background. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where Georgia is living. And I did my preparatory studies before college at the Cleveland Institute of Music, which then defined itself and still defines itself as a classical-only conservatory. So my background, I studied trombone principally, piano not as well. But my background was very much in classical music. I went to Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. For my undergraduate, I wound up then going to Michigan and finally for my PhD to Eastman School of Music. All of these are, at least at the time, very heavily focused on classical music. I wrote a very formalist atonal dissertation. And that said, I'll say, in addition to growing up in Cleveland and going to the Cleveland Orchestra, one of the finest orchestras in the world, I also went to a lot of musical theater. I played in musical theater pits. I loved the form. I always just truly enjoyed musical theater, but it never occurred to me that that's music to study. And it never occurred to me because it's something that nobody was doing at the time. And certainly at the Eastman School of Music, I had no thoughts that I could even propose. It's not that anybody said no to me. It's simply that nobody had done so. And so I thought, well, this isn't something that one can study. The landscape has changed considerably now, and it's changed so much that some people wonder whether it's okay to write on classical music, especially by dead white guys. And I'll say that I think it is. That's my spoiler for the end. So I'll start with a bit of history and then quickly move up to the present day and describe where I think we are right now and where I think we can go as a field. Some people see this as a time of crisis, but I'm a generally optimistic person. And I think that what we have here is a signal moment, and we have an enormous opportunity to create a far broader field. In fact, it might just be a matter of convincing people that the field has already broadened. And that the old stereotypes of what music theory entails and what, if anything, it excludes no longer apply. So you saw some stories at the end of Elie Hassama's essay about women doing work that isn't considered real music theory. I think we're in a position to change the narrative, and I think that the next generation of scholars I hope we'll ask that question, what is this really music theory with less frequency? Certainly the border between, if there is a border, what's what we consider musicology and music theory, these are distinctly two different things in North America, unlike in Europe. I understand that in continental Europe, musicology is often considered broadly as the study of music. I mean, that's what it means. In North America, it's become defined more narrowly, both because of the actions of what we now call historical musicologists and music theorists. So here's a too simple sketch of the schism that happened between musicology and music theory in North America. In the 1970s, the same time when the Americanists split off of the American Musicological Society, as Schenkerian analysis and pitch class set theory informed analysis were becoming the lingua franca of Eastern US conservatories and university music departments. By Eastern, I mean Eastern US, I should say. The American Musicological Society, the AMS, was programming really only token amounts of what we thought of as hardcore analytical work in their annual meeting programs and in the pages of their flagship journal, JAMS. In 1977, there was a decision, it was a very hotly contested decision, to splinter off of the AMS and to start a Society for Music Theory, SMT. Incidentally, so the Society for American Music splintered off also 2 years earlier than that, and for similar reasons. I mean, the American Musicological Society generally referred to its location, not to the music that was principally studied by its members, who, as Georgia said, were rather Eurocentric and also had a strong focus on early music. After SMT was founded, I think there was a period of retrenchment in both musicology and music theory. The two societies, AMS and SMT, have met in tandem every other year, but they have often been parallel conferences occurring at the same hotel, but with very few SMT members at AMS sessions and vice versa. So as I said, I'm speaking to you right now. Here, I'll share my screen. I'm speaking to you right now from the city of New Orleans. There I am yesterday with our executive director, Jennifer Diaz. We're here preparing the conference with the executive directors of AMS and SEM, that's the Society for Ethnomusicology, for the conference that's coming up in 2022, which I would invite you all to attend. And we do have subventions from SMT and probably the other societies for foreign people who need to travel from abroad. So there's some money available. It'll be in New Orleans, which is a great city. And what excites me about this, we met about 10 years ago. We had the same thing, the triple meeting of these societies in New Orleans. And I don't think there was a lot of cross-fertilization, to be honest, at that meeting. I will confess that I didn't go to any ethnomusicology papers, and maybe only a small handful of musicology ones. I stuck to my own society, Society for Music Theory. This year, there's a much, much bigger effort to really bring in true joint work. And there's a lot more joint work. There's a lot more cross-fertilization between the fields. A lot of ethnomusicologists are doing very analytical work on world music. A lot of music theorists are doing work that is far more, that deals with culture and history in a much deeper way. I think that period of retrenchment is over. So let me go back to the past now. At the 25th anniversary of SMT in 2002, Richmond Brown, a former secretary of our society, gave a talk at a banquet that we had. And it was published in March of 2003 in Music Theory Online, one of our 4 journals, called The Deep Background of Our Society, a reference to Schenkerian analysis. In that talk, he said, and this seems like ancient history, perhaps, to some of you younger people, but this was when I was a new assistant professor at Florida State University. So I had my PhD and I was on my 3rd job already. So Richmond said, and I'll quote it here, "I think the core competence of a theorist rests on mastery of analytic technique of core repertoires. That was and is our central claim. He said, my belief is that theory rests on analysis based on intellectual power, not just description. A theorist is a master analyst. There's so much of this gendered writing at that time. Master is such a male term. Master analyst, certainly of tonal music, preferably also of 20th century music, and preferably of some other historical or contemporary genre. The proliferation of worthy topics like jazz, feminism, world music, or cognition is welcome and adds to the value of music education in itself. But the rock of theory is analytic mastery. To the extent that the SMT as a group of, or individuals who call themselves theorists walk away from the analytic agenda, so much do they and we risk marginalizing ourselves. Diversity cannot be a cover for the SMT becoming an orphanage. This view of music theory is from a very different time. I think it was already outdated in 2003 when it was delivered at that banquet. But Richmond Brown's essay describes the discipline as I think I saw it when I was in graduate school. I earned my PhD from the Eastman School in 1998, just to contextualize that. And I think it's very, very safe to say that music theory had a very clear core. Prolongational analysis of tonal music, Schenkerian analysis, set theoretical analysis of atonal music, following Alan Fort and a whole slew of Princeton scholars, including Milton Babbitt, Donald Martino, and such, and history of theory and also form studies. And just as we had our core, I think we also had a very big and undiscussed diversity problem, with a strong majority of men dominating the field and very few non-white people who identified themselves as music theorists. A much bigger diversity problem than musicology has, in fact. So Elie Hassama, in the essay that I asked you to look at, asks, can music theory be a place where all people, including female, queer, non-binary, BIPOC, and disabled people, feel supported and their interests encouraged? Does it provide a space in which we and our work matter? I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute and come back to my PowerPoint so I can just talk to you. So I think I would answer Ellie's question as historically no, but I believe that we will, and indeed I think that we already are a space where everybody's voice matters. But I also think that we need to work very hard to convince people that that's true. And that they won't be ostracized for doing some particular kinds of scholarship. And here's where we have a very big hurdle to overcome. There are innovative scholars, many young, but not all, who wonder whether their work can be accepted by music theory. At the same time, there are many classical music scholars, many older, but not all. I have a couple of graduate students who are who work more conservatively in tonal music. And so especially people who work with Schenkerian analysis, or more broadly prolongational analysis, and even more broadly, just scholars of dead white European male composers who are very concerned that their work has been left behind. There's a number of American scholars who fear that the vogue term is cancellation, and that they can't get onto SMT programs. So here, I'll actually quote myself, because I've been president only for a few months, and one of my first tasks was to write a newsletter article, one of our society's publications. And I will just say, it was one of the hardest things I've ever written in my life. So at the risk of quoting myself, I'll just share what I wrote. This is our newsletter, which you can get for free on our website. I said, when I took the gavel, I promised that I would do my best to ensure that SMT is an organization that expands and diversifies while honoring and continuing to support the scholarly work that has always been part of our discipline. I said then, and I still believe, that these aims are not contradictory. Embracing new ideas does not mean discarding older ones. Creating a welcoming space for scholars from different musical, and or ethnic and racial backgrounds does not mean that we will no longer study Western classical music. It does, however, mean that we need to learn to think more inclusively, setting aside notions of what is central, canonical even, and what is peripheral. Some people see this period as fraught. I see it as exciting because productive change affecting all aspects of our society is afoot. In these times, how can we not feel moved to expand what we value and whom we include? Sometimes these cultural touchstones, painful though they are, inspire action. So what is the path forward? I certainly can't say exactly, and I don't see any easy solutions to the fact that we have to diversify and we also have to respect where we've been. But there are directions that we can head and things that we can do. I think it might well be a mistake to target certain groups. We do need groups of minoritized scholars to make recommendations and tell me, a cisgender straight white guy who got elected president of this organization, what we're doing wrong. And we have standing committees, just as the AMS has standing committees in the society. We have the Committee on the Status of Women, a Committee on Race and Diversity, a Committee on Queer Scholars and Scholarship. These are standing committees within the society, not interest groups. And I don't think that we need to make deliberate overtures to the LGBTQ community, to women, to minorities, and so forth, so much as we really need to make it clear that music theory is a broad discipline that can speak to, and I think more importantly, can listen to, people who make and who value all sorts of music. This is a very delicate thing, but I think that there's a difference between encouraging scholarship to represent music and groups that aren't represented versus simply maintaining an openness to accept diverse kinds of scholarship. I think we probably need to do both of those things, and both are difficult. So I don't think it's wise for us to say, I'll stop sharing again. I only have some sporadic PowerPoint things. I don't think it's wise to say that classical music is white and largely created by men, and therefore we need to branch out. For me, the better approach is to say that there is structure and meaning to all music, and we need to support scholars who investigate all music. So what does it mean to support music scholarship? SMT does not have a lot of money, but we do have journals, and we have a really big conference each year, as I talked about. We can be, and we have been, broader in what we publish and we accept for publication. And I think it's a mistake to write off people as non-diverse because of what they look like and what they study. I hope that's true. Last year was probably our most diverse conference ever. And the program chair was a white guy who studies Schenkerian analysis, Frank Semirato. Our current editor of Music Theory Spectrum, which is our major print journal, is Peter Smith, who's a Brahms scholar who also engages with prolongational analysis. I'll show some tables of contents. So I'm going back and forth with my PowerPoint. There we go. This is the current table of contents of Music Theory Spectrum. It came out about a month ago, I guess. No, maybe a couple of months ago. So you can see it has hip hop music, something on hierarchies in music, on John Corigliano, on Bach, a very broad thing on sequences, Mendelssohn. This is fairly, this is maybe a slightly more traditional journal, but then we also have a colloquy on reframing music theory, which came from our 2019 plenary session, which includes the Phil Ewell essay, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, but also Yayoi Uno Everett talking about including non-Western music, Joseph Strauss talking about disability studies in music, and Eli Hassama talking more broadly, this is the essay that I asked you to look at, Getting to Count. So one of the things that I've come to realize is that we can't only change the field through our traditional journals, Music Theory Spectrum, and our conference, because people who subscribe to Music Theory Spectrum And people who attend our annual conference are already SMT members. These are, you have to be an SMT member to attend our conference, and that this is a benefit of membership as you get our journal. So we're talking to ourselves largely when we diversify these spaces. And that's an important thing, but we also have been trying to change the medium. Our two newest journals, SMTV, sorry, I'll show a recent table of contents. This just came out yesterday. I know it says March, but it was just announced yesterday. And I'll actually just say, there's one of the essays here from the, and this is free and open online. A Bevy of Biases, How Music Theory's Methodological Problems Hinder Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion by Justin London, who is a former president of the society. This is a response to Phil Ewell's essay. And he talks about how some of our notions of structure are overdetermined when our canon is too heavily Bach, Haydn, Beethoven, Mozart, which is true of Schenkerian analysis, which is true of William Kaplan's book, and so forth. It's a really interesting essay. I strongly encourage it. So our two newest journals, we have SMTV, which is a video journal. Articles are no longer than 15 minutes long, and SMT Pod, which is a podcast on issues that intersect with music theory. These excite me tremendously, and for two reasons. One, they are both open access and available on the internet to everyone, rather like AMS's Musicology Now blog. And they are aimed both at scholars and potential scholars. They're aimed at all musicians. Anyone who has really begun their musical training is invited in, and to see the kind of work that we do as music theory. You can see some of the recent issues. The Noriko Manabe's talk on, it's called Abe Road. It's on Japanese Beatle parodies that are political, and it's absolutely fascinating. It blends linguistics, a study of popular music, and a reading of politics, all within one, and it's about 10 minutes long. It's very, very easy to watch, and it's very stimulating. Scott Murphy has a very contrapuntal talk on Clara Schumann. You can see last year's volume. There's something on piano rolls, dance and music theory. This is a big interest group that we have. A Schoenberg one which sort of recreates his film music. I had one in there on Take Me Out to the Ball Game, which is a very, very popular tune that Americans all sing when they go to the baseball park. Baseball season just began yesterday, which has me very, very excited. An essay on Turkish classical makam, and Megan Levengood has one on what she calls the complement chorus, looking at particularly millennial pop. These are all essays. None of these are rudimentary essays. It's not about how we do music theory. It's an example of what music theory is. Because our undergraduates tend to stereotype music theory as studying chords and labeling scales and things that are very, very rudimentary, and things that I honestly wish we wouldn't call music theory, because it's more like fundamentals. Anyway, that's an aside. SMT Pod is the latest thing, and you can actually download it like you download podcasts on your phone and listen to it, or you can listen to it online. Here's the recent season. Joe Strauss, who is another former president of Society for Music Theory, and who was really trend-setting in his work on disability studies, extends that to notions of old age through a disability studies lens. And he has a 5-part podcast on the stereotypes and the roles that we expect old people to play, both in real life and also in opera. And the kinds of stereotypes that we place on older composers, how we stereotype Stravinsky's late work, Copland's late work, Elliott Carter's late work. There's there's a lot on popular music here. There's Scott Murphy has a really interesting one on Buxtehude. That's the very first episode that we have. I would say that I listened to episodes of this while driving to New Orleans. It's about a 6-hour drive for me from Tallahassee, and it just had me absolutely riveted. It's really great, great material, and it's especially great because I think that this is a way of appealing to. It's a way of appealing to broader audiences, but it's also, I think, a way of moving away from the fact that we are so tied to print media. We see print as the highest level of academic achievement in our field. And not just our field, but in academia writ large. Universities privilege articles in books above presentations at conferences. And we regard issues of SMT Pod and SMTV as articles. They are juried and they are published. And I think that this is a very, very good trend to diversify what we consider as scholarly, and therefore who can do scholarship. I will say personally, I much prefer delivering talks to writing articles. Some people see that as a failing of mine. I think if it's done well, a talk is an entirely different sort of writing than we find in articles and books. It's not easier, it's not harder, it's different. And sometimes I can use creative visuals in my articles. I'm not doing that so much right now. Sometimes through tone of voice, I can convey things that I can't convey as easily in print. I have to be more careful. I can use a lot more casual language in spoken word, which I prefer. My point here is that it would be great to give more weight to spoken word and to have actual scholars talking to people about what we do. And this is a way of bringing them in that doesn't feel like as much work as here, read this article. And I hope that the field agrees, and I hope that American and international universities give these new media articles appropriate weight. I think that we have broader reach as music theory and scholarship writ large when we can create videos and podcasts and blogs. And I think that it's very helpful when we can lay aside jargon and attempt to speak to wider audiences without making our work less scholarly and without softening the points that we hope to make. Then aside, music theory, as most of you know, relies on a lot of jargon. And that's often a barrier to entry, and one I think that goes both ways. Someone interested in a particular composer might not know Hepikowski and Darcy's sonata theory and their terms for the various parts of a sonata, much less the various types of sonatas that they enumerate. I confess, I easily forget those types too. What's a type 2 sonata, type 3 sonata? It's not my field. When people talk that way at conferences, it often leaves me behind. Or they might not know what neo-Riemannian transformations are. But the underlying concepts of all of these things can really be explained rather easily. Poundy Burstein, who teaches at CUNY and is another former president of Society for Music Theory, suggested to a class of students at my university recently that the sonata theory terms P and S and T and EEC, they can all be spelled out as primary and secondary themes, transitions, expositional closure. We don't need the jargon. We don't need, and it's exclusionary, and we need to realize that. And the jargon barrier is even greater when it comes to inviting people to talk to us about music that they are expert in. Does someone who works in musical theater need to work through all of Kaplan's book to talk about sentential structures? That's something that I do. And sentences are far, far more common in musical theater works, American and British musical theater, than they are in Beethoven. We always use Beethoven Opus 2 No. 1 as like our standard example of what a sentence is, but there's better examples in other literature. Maybe not better. There's more examples in other literature. does someone who works in popular music need to learn these terms, or can we adapt to multiple ways of explaining a concept? I'll bring in two pieces of scholarship, which I don't have listed on my PowerPoint, I apologize. My colleague at FSU, Rachel Lumsden, has a fairly recent, about a year-old MTO article, Music Theory Online, where she documents cases of, a particular case of a woman who wrote about musical structure in a 19th century journal devoted to girls, the Girls' Own Journal from Britain. And she describes music in vivid ways, using a lot of metaphor. A rondo form is talked about as like a dress of alternating cloths. And Rachel mentions this as an example of something that has been excluded from music theory, that we don't even see it as part of our canon of people who talk about music structure, because it's not using jargon, and it's also using terms that are appealing to, particularly meant to appeal to girls. And we tend not to take things that are meant to appeal to women, and especially to girls, very seriously. Clifton Boyd, who's just finishing his PhD, who I guess just finished his PhD and is starting a job at NYU next year, has coined a term that he calls vernacular music theory. He works on barbershop quartet music, which is, if you don't know barbershop quartets, that's an American vocal quartet that sings in very tight harmonies. And within the barbershop quartet community, people learn to compose and to categorize features of their music. Taxonomy, a core value of music theory. Acknowledging the kinds of descriptions that they use, which are not the kinds of descriptions that we use, as music theories, I think would quickly expand the range of what we see as music theory, and would be a very quick path toward diversifying who we see as music theorists. So that's my soapbox there, my podium. As for the range of topics that are supported, I would just invite you to look at the recent pages of Spectrum, Music Theory Online, SMT Pod, and to look at recent conference programs. Also, I would suggest I should do a different share. Looking at our interest groups. What we call interest groups are similar to what AMS calls study groups. I will shift my sharing. And we have a lot of them, something like 27, world music, autographs and archival documents. That was once thought of as the province of musicology. I just got back from a week in London in archives, so something that I'm interested in as well. Dance and movement, early music analysis, film and multimedia. This is also where our Musicology is situated. Video game music. Global Interculturalism and Musical Peripheries interest group. We have a History of Theory interest group, which is funny to have that as an interest group, given that that was initially just a core part of our field. And now they wanted to create a space for themselves, so they created an interest group. An interest group on improvisation, which is different from our jazz interest group. The improvisation interest group is more on classical improvisation. It was recently chaired by my colleague Gilad Rabinovich, who works on Partimenti and on schema theory. A mathematics of music interest group, a music and disability interest group, music and philosophy, music and psychoanalysis, music cognition, music informatics, music notation and visualization, music theory pedagogy, one of our newest, musical theater. That makes me very happy. It was started by a couple of my graduate students, actually. A performance and analysis interest group, popular music, post-1945 music analysis, that's really concert music, a queer resource group, a Russian music theory interest group, Scholars for Social Responsibility, that's a more of a kind of political interest group, timbre and orchestration, and work and family, which is more of a service kind of interest group, talking about how members who have children and other family issues that need to be attended to can balance those things and have successful careers in academia. So these are big sites for a lot of new work in the field. I'll now just say, I'll stop sharing for a second, a couple of things about curriculum and hiring in the US, since Max asked us to talk about that a little bit. And to follow up on what Georgia said. Let me get a drink, sorry. So first of all, a lot of programs are going through periods of curricular reexamination. And I would say in music theory, one popular stance is getting rid of part writing and counterpoint as core undergraduate curriculum and focusing more on analysis, also including popular and world music to a greater extent in our basic courses. I will also say that I think that that can work well for certain kinds of programs. For example, Harvard very famously recently revamped its curriculum. But Harvard is not a conservatory or a classical music program. They're primarily a graduate program in music theory and musicology, and they serve really a small number of undergraduate music majors, and they often have eclectic tastes and backgrounds. So what about schools that primarily train classical musicians and that employ music theorists and musicologists who were schooled in the Western tradition, people like me, people like Georgia? Should we start teaching classes on subjects that we know relatively little about? I will say personally, I'm very afraid of being a dilettante, of teaching something I don't know well. I'm also very afraid of not serving our students well, students who've come to us to study classical music. I should say Florida State University is the third largest school of music in the country, and the majority of our students are classical music scholars, but we also have musical theater and commercial music and jazz as big programs. So I think we owe our students in classical music to expose them to a range of other musics, but we also owe it to them to prepare them for life as a performer or scholar of repertoire that they want to play and study. So I think undergraduate programs need to and have started asking questions about whether their potentials, that is to say, I think that potential undergraduate students should be asking questions about what their potential schools will be, how they, I'm not speaking well, how will they be supporting them? And graduate students need to be asking questions about what kinds of material they'll get to teach and what kinds of material they'll get to study. So I do think that in comprehensive music schools like Florida State University, where I teach, or Eastman, Indiana, Cincinnati, Michigan, a host of other places, I think that we're going to start creating tracks. I don't think that our classical-centered curriculum with a heavy emphasis on voice leading and harmony particularly serves our jazz majors, our musical theater majors, our commercial music majors very well. So it might be better if their theory courses covered materials and techniques that were more native to the music that they want to specialize in. I can say more about this if you like, but I'll move on to where I see American graduate programs and also onto hiring. Some of our American programs specialize in particular areas of scholarship. Northwestern University and Ohio State University, for example, have very strong programs in music cognition. Choosing where you want to study, and I realize that some of the people we're speaking to will decide to go to North America to study music theory or musicology. So choosing where you want to study based on what you want to study, I think makes a lot of sense. But I think you should also ask a lot of questions. I've written these down. I think that some of the questions that you can ask, say that again, include, what will I teach? As a graduate student, most graduate students have teaching obligations. What is the coursework for your university, and what do you imagine it to, and what do you imagine to be the coming doctoral seminars? What are the faculty at your university publishing and presenting on? What are the students publishing and presenting on? Are your students getting jobs? And what's the placement record? These are all fair questions. Excuse me. And I would also say, when you're looking at programs, don't only talk to faculty. Faculty will give you the best view of their university. I'm not going to say that we're going to lie, but we'll give you the nicest view, I think. I would make it a real point to talk with graduate students at the universities that you're thinking about attending. Ask them whether they're well treated. Ask them whether the faculty have time to sponsor independent research studies. Ask about faculty attitudes towards students and toward teaching. I will say at FSU, we welcome foreign students, And I don't think that classical music studies are dying, but they are certainly less popular than when I was in school. That doesn't mean that you can't study that doesn't mean you can't study classical music and get great jobs in classical music scholarship. It just means that not everywhere is going to be equally supportive, and there will be fewer jobs down the pipe. So you need to do your homework. I'm happy to answer questions, and into the future, I'm happy to meet privately with any of you who want to talk about your scholarly interests and how they might be best supported if you decide to come to and work and study in North America. So I'll stop there, and I will leave it for room for discussion. I'm honored to get to talk to you all. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Georgia, again for with very wide spectrum and mind-opening talks. I'm sure that we have a lot to digest and a lot to think about. Maybe it's a good moment to take a 5 minutes break just to stretch our legs and to fresh our mind, and then we go back to Giovanni Giuriati and offer for some small respondent moment, and then we open the floor to discussion. Okay, so let's say 5 p.m. Our time in 8 minutes. Okay, you good? See you soon. If Giovanni is ready to start his talk, and thank you, Giovanni. That's your...
Yes, okay. Thank you, Massimiliano. Thank you. And thank you also to George and Michael. It was really an inspiring session, inspiring to hear these developments, recent developments in the life of your societies. Much has changed since I was doing my PhD in Baltimore in the 1980s. So just some reaction to what you have said, starting to just clarify that the ADWIM, the Association of Italian Teachers in Musicology at the university, is not really a scientific society, does not organize annual meetings or runs a journal, so has a publication. And of course, the size is less conspicuous than that of your societies. Actually, I was in Tallahassee for a SEM conference in 1980 something, 85, I guess. So the Italian university professor altogether, musicology and ethnomusicology are by now, and there has been quite an increase in the past year, at 140. So the size is not the same as yours. Well, some first reactions come from, I try to be brief, but some first reactions come from the very different history of our country, of Italy. For instance, the racial issue in our country is not felt as much as it is in the United States. We do not have any colonial past, colonial in a very broad sense, in early or more recent times. So these kind of issues are less conspicuous, even though they are starting coming up and springing up, also with the flow, conspicuous flow of immigration that we start having in our country, that really started in the 90s, let's say. So it's really a recent phenomenon. Another thing is that we traditionally have been focused much more on our own music history and music cultures of Italy. This is both for musicology and ethnomusicology as well, since recent time. Very much involved in social and political issues of our own country since World War II, after the fascist period. So this has been much focus of concentration. Music and politics somehow has been relevant for most of us for a long time. And now we are in a period perhaps or more detachment from that perspective. One issue that has been really important for us has been to reflect on our European perspective. In these few years, this has been an issue. The East-West divide, for instance, that we are now trying to cope with in several ways. I can mention the series that Gianmario, who is here, is running about musical cultures of 20th century for Routledge, that includes in the scientific committee members from different parts of Europe. And in this, there is also the language barrier that for you is something that is not mentioned. That might even be a matter of some study group, of interest group, because language is also something that determines positions and ideas and ideologies. So now we are, especially in ethnomusicology, we are dealing with the post-colonial perspective and decolonizing issues, and also approaches that deal with more, this is what we're trying to do, more dialogic and collaborative perspectives in our research in several ways, including between musicologists and musicians, which is something that traditionally in our musicology has been less relevant. The issue of identity, I can recall here the IMS meeting that was organized in Rome about maybe 10 years ago or 8 years ago, whose the president of the scientific committee was Fabrizio Della Seta, who is another Cremonese who just retired, but still has a great influence in our musicology. The issue of identity, or not decline as nationalism, but a complex issue that has to deal with a global world. So this is one of the main topics, I think, that is peculiar of our own musicology. At the other end, one thing that I think we share with what you were presenting, this idea of the increasing integration between musicology, ethnomusicology, popular music studies, that are all present and increasingly present in our departments, and even the ADWIM, our society, includes all kind of musicologists in one society. Media studies, and this is also something that is becoming more integrated in our curricula. The issue of music and gender, that is more shared here, even though it's not such a burning issue, I'm afraid, yet in our group, in our society, in our field. I just was checking that is conspicuous somehow also among our professors at the university in musicology, the cleavage, the difference between male and female, that is still present, and it's something that we should certainly address. The literature, and there are several scholars that are working on this, and which is, I think, very welcome. And I think we should do more and take more action on this, and take also some inspiration from what you are doing. Other common issues that are springing up in our musicology right now is the issue of environment and ecomusicology, soundscape studies. That is really an issue that is taking a lot of ground, as well as it is something that is in our system now. I mean, the administrative system, what we call terza missione, third mission, that has to do with dissemination, repatriation, didactics. This is even evaluated by authorities, but is something that is becoming more and more embedded in our activity. So the question that both of you were addressing of what is the relevance and how our work has to deal with society at large, I think is also becoming more and more increasingly important in what we are doing. And one issue that for us, and in this I see something that you didn't mention so explicitly, music as heritage. This is a very important and controversial issue in a way because of the UNESCO processes, but also archives and conservation of memory, and again, the social impact that this has on communities. And this is something on which there is some debate in Italy. So just to make some comments on what you said. One thing that I notice is this very, very strong emphasis on contemporary issues. While you are going through global views on music, extended in many, many ways, I'm wondering, and from our Italian perspective, somehow, what happens of the historiographic methods? Are there innovative positions also on these kind of issues? And together with this, how do you deal with, because this is a problem that we also have somehow with underrepresented disciplines. I'm thinking of medieval music or early music, for instance. In Italy, also music analysis somehow, and music theory, organology. I understand that we have to move away from a certain past that is sometimes hard to withstand, but somehow in what I also feel in the debate here in Italy, there is the risk of neglecting certain aspects of our disciplines or underrepresenting them. And just to conclude, while methods and main issues that you exposed to us, presented to us, might be slightly different in focus, one aspect that seems to me that is shared, and I really sympathize very much with this, is the reconfiguration of our fields and our methods, which is a deep and profound reconfiguration that is most welcome. And on this, I think we are on the same wavelength, because ethnomusicology, musicology, popular music studies, media studies merge when we refer to ecology, global histories, mediatization, and so on. And probably it is at this kind of juncture that we may find a lot of common ground between the two sides of the ocean. And a last word about recruitment, because here the system works in a very, very different way. We have a centralized way of recruiting our colleagues in which the choice about topics and fields, specific fields in which hire someone is somehow blurred by a system that recognizes merit at the central level, in which each department is less free to take one direction or another one. I mean, I'm not saying that it's impossible, of course, and it is done, but we have, each department has less autonomy, let's say, in choosing a certain field or a certain way of hiring in the hiring process. Thank you.
So, thank you, Giovanni. And I think I give the floor to Offer for the last.
Use this microphone,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to kind of tell you a little bit about musicology and ethnomusicology in Israel, where I come from. I'm going to say kind of broad things about just the scope and the size of the field in Israel, and then connect my points to the rest of the speakers that spoke before, and try to kind of see how similar issues are coming out in Israeli and in Israeli-Palestinian scholarship. So we are basically, we have a very small musicology field. We are 5 departments. Some of them are 3 or 4 faculty members, not more than that. I think one thing that is very important for Israel is that there are other places that musicology is taught, even though it's not declared formally as a musicology department. So seminars for music teachers, music academies, music therapy programs. These are all places that they are also part of the discourse in Israel, and they are important, I think, to mention. And maybe I'll explain why I think they're important later. The normal connection in Israel is between musicology and the humanities, meaning there is a much more focus on text, much more focus on musical text and on the written word. And in my case, in my department, we are in a music school, and so we are making efforts to create interdisciplinary opportunities for the students. This year we have a collaboration between composers and architectures and composers and media students to create works together, so things related to 3D and space and technology, and trying to bring these things together as much as we possible and take advantage of the fact that we are in the same kind of smaller institution. We have similarly to or kind of midway point in between the US and Italy, we have 2 scholarly societies. One is for musicology that often includes ethnomusicology and analysis in the kind of papers that are presented. And we have a separate ethnomusicology forum that is presenting usually more straightforward ethnographic-based work. And this is mainly because if we think about what kind of issues are being analyzed and thought of in Israel, many of them relate to traditional music of Jewish people, traditional musics of Muslim and Palestinian and Arab people in the region, and the interaction between them. I'll mention a few important works from my perspective from the recent years. So a book by Nili Belkind called Music in Conflict, dealing with relationship between Palestinian and Israelis. The work of Nadim Kalkabi on Palestinian youth in Haifa and on the role of Arabic language among Jewish Israeli singers. So there's a kind of gradation of Arabic that goes from gibberish to really fully speaking and using Arabic as a really expressive mode. We also have a kind of musicology that is somehow out of space, meaning people doing work that is not grounded in Israel in any way, but working on sonata form, for example, Joel Greenberg with a new book, or Michal Friedlander with a new book on staging voice, things that are would be considered part of historical musicology in a more general sense. And then finally, people that are working on really specifically on the history of Jewish music in Israel. Asaf Sheleg, for example, is important for really finding the way to sew together historical musicology, in his case, Zionism, and the way these two are in an interface with each other. So one of the things that is important for me to mention is how scholars are taking very desperate sides of the musicology, ethnomusicology, music theory spectrum, and are putting them together in ways that I think are very important. So for example, we mentioned Justin London before, his work with Nori Jacobi about intercultural cognition studies, really opening the field in a way that is very important. So putting ethnomusicology field work with experimental methods from music cognition. And to me, these are kind of the things we need to look for and look at, is what happens when we take the most extreme elements of the field, or things we don't think should be in dialogue, organology and gender studies, I don't know, but think about it in those ways and connecting them together. And I think with that, I'll just go to a couple of my notes. So just noting how important the changes that are happening in the journals are for teaching. For me to have composers like William Dawson, Florence Price, African-American scholars from the beginning of the century at jams in the recent years was crucial, because if there's no scholarship that we personally create, then we cannot teach, and so it becomes a loop that feeds itself. So mentioning also Nomi Andre for opera and blackness in opera, really crucial elements to being able to address these issues, not only in kind of musicological op-eds that tell us we need to move into these directions, but actually examples of research that shows us and analyzes these things, and this is very important. The things that I wanted to point out also is the importance between diversity in topics and diversity in researchers. And these are not always overlapping, and the question of who can say what is something that I think we should bring up for discussion. And finally, connecting to the last point, in ethnomusicology, an essay by a scholar named Daniel Brown was really important for this conversation of who gets to speak, who gets to enter the field, and what music they need to research in order to be able to penetrate into the field. So very important conversation for ethnomusicology. And finally, one last remark is that the students are very important for me in telling me and telling us as teachers what are the methods that they are interested in learning. And I think philology, textual studies, organology, people are interested in knowing these things because they are strange, because they are of a different era. And so I really think it's important to maintain them also because it's coming from the students. These are tools. That's my comment. Thank you.
So thank you all for this little insight. Now it's time to open the floor to discussion. So I ask the colleagues, both in physically here and virtually, if they have some comments that they want to share, and also the students who are here and on Zoom, if they want to address any question or comment. Feel free to write in the chat if you are too shy to speak up, or if you just want to talk, just raise your hand physically and virtually.
And I would just add that it would be nice for us to hear about your interests and the things that you personally or collectively are interested in. That's something that, in a way, I felt like I was speaking in a vacuum because I'm not as familiar with that, and I'm here to learn from you as well.
Likewise.
Sure. So who wants to respond to that? Or should I do the honors? Okay. I remember my first SMT meeting. It was Milwaukee, 2011, and I was sort of surprised of the variety and the many aspects covered by the discipline. And I was coming from a place where we combine musicology and music theory, and I had a strong background, but at a certain point it was sort of disappointing not getting into the jargon that you were speaking, not getting into the instantly in the way that you were dealing with the disciplines. So it took some efforts in order to become acquainted with the sort of liturgy, if I may say so, And once you get used to something that you were not familiar with, you become thinking of the structures and of the different topics, and you go deep inside, and below the surface, you can start making notes to what you are familiar with. So to say that after the first moment of astonishment, I started to think that we were looking at things from different perspectives, and I was able to connect in a much better way. This little experience was then even more intense when I became the chair of the interest group in improvisation for the before Gilad, and we had to really strive for diversity and try to talk to each other. So what we are doing here, I think, is extremely important, and it's also a bell that is ringing for our own department and on our own way of doing musicology. As I was telling you in our private conversation, I think we are the largest department in Italy for sure, and maybe in Europe for numbers of people and a variety of interests. So we could really start our own interest groups here with our students and with our focuses. But what we need to emphasize and to improve maybe is a better circulation of idea. We have different approaches, and then connecting research with what we teach is not always straightforward. I mean, we have a rather conservative curriculum. I remember that when I did my PhD here, I was the first one to write something about an art songwriter, Paolo Conte, as a dissertation. At that moment, it was seen like something revolutionary, and now it's regarded as something usual. Of course, times is a gentleman, as we say, and things are evolving. The discipline is evolving all together with the people that are into it. So it's real. It's really what we heard, that our interests, our own way of dealing with things, of mixing up things that are maybe disconnected, apparently, make them connected in new ways. So we have this conservative structure, but I think we are improving, and we are sort of fighting for keeping what we think is important. Offer mentioned philology. I think this school was born as a philology center of real high quality, and we still are doing critical editions. We are still doing with textual criticism, but we also deal with digital eras, and so we cope with texts that are not written texts anymore. We have a Bob's scholar. We have Ethnomusicology that came into our curriculum while we were ending our studies here as a program as students. Then we have a great and increasing interest in multimedia studies. Then the problem here is maybe how that there is a sort of slowdown in the process of incorporating these new things into the way we teach. I don't know if the colleagues here are with me on this statement, if they want to do any and add some perspectives. Just recently, we were discussing a revamp of our curriculum, dividing different into several possible tracks. So I cannot remember how many they are. Please help me. 7, 6.
4. So there are 5 paths, and one of them are split in other 4. So it's kind of
9.
More than 10, yeah.
It's more than 10. Trying to cover all the aspects. So I speak for my little field now, which is organology. So we try to create a track that combined what we consider the core of musicology, that is still analysis and music history and history of literature, history of art, because we have maybe this broader perspective on what a musicologist should do, with specific training in history of musical instruments, building techniques, materials, and restoration and conservation issues. And this is just an example. Somebody else wants to carry on? Yes, Gianmario, please. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was very, very interesting. Thank you, Max, for initiating this. I would like to concentrate about the American-European relationships, which was a little bit in background, but is one of the precondition of what we are doing here. And while you were presenting your situation, especially in the United States, I remembered many of the colleagues whom we invited during the last 20, 25 years, Anthony Newcomb, Repertoires, Kofi Agawu, David Lewin, and there are many, many, many. And what I'm observing also as a corresponding member of the American Musicological Society is a kind of, and a visitor of the universities in the United States, it is a kind of growing difference between continental Europe and the United States, which is in contrary motion what we experienced towards the end of the 20th century. And I don't know, there are many causes of this, and certainly what Michael describes, and also Georgia, brings more focus about questions which, as Giovanni noticed, are not or were not at the center of the discussion here in continental Europe, or less important, such as colonialism, ethnicity, and civil rights, music connected with civil rights, and so on. So this is a kind of immanent thing. If you work on your repertoire, you have less interest on this. We do not have this strong difference between historical musicology and analytical musicology and music theory that you have in the United States. And I think, especially in Italy, the distance between musicology, theoretical and historical, and ethnomusicology is not so strong, was not so strong. I remember that the modern founders of ethnomusicology, Roberto Leidi and Diego Carpitello, were closely connected to composers of written music of the Italian avant-garde, Luciano Berio and others. So the kind of exchange, we grew up, Giovanni and me, in a climate of reciprocal exchange and not indifference to each other. But again, my concern is that there is a kind of, with this new focus in American musicology and music theory, there is less interest for, I see less interest for the history of musicology in general, of the early centuries, and less interest on topics related to traditional methodology, which is reflected in American music journals, who almost do not have continental authors. The last one I remember in the AMS Journal of American Gems is Esteban Buch, but maybe there are something else. So what we are trying, Giovanni mentioned my initiative with Routledge Musical Cultures of the 20th century. It was also not only an attempt to interconnect different European experiences in the field of musicology, but also to keep this dialogue awake in this period. So my question to our American colleagues would be simply, if you are not interested in white, male, dead composers, so probably you are not interested in European musicology either, or you are less interested as before. I'm sorry, I'm a little provocative, but I don't mean it to be.
Okay.
I could certainly say that, Michael, do you want to go ahead?
Please.
I was just going to say briefly that I think Michael and I are speaking for the field at large and not our personal interests. Right. I certainly, my scholarship will always be centered in European music, and many of our colleagues will be. We were talking about progressive trends today, but, and I was talking about the study groups, which transpire in the evenings at AMS meetings. But the field of musicology is still a rather conservative field compared to literature and many other fields. And we are still free to continue work in the fields that we have always done. Some of us are choosing to have a secondary field in one of these more forward-looking subgenres. I personally have not done that, although I'm interested in all of them. I like reading in them, but I will continue my work. I was just looking over the faculties of some of the different universities in this country, and I noticed that really, I had thought of the different universities. There's certainly ones that have specialties, but almost all of them have senior scholars who are doing very important work in European music. And I would be honored to be considered one of them at some point. And then younger scholars are introducing courses and mentorship in newer areas. Then also European, I guess I don't like that epithet of dead white composers either, dead white men, because that's who I work on. And I think that most of the American universities, and certainly the ones that are the most esteemed, do have more of a balance than I was expecting. Harvard would be an exception. Harvard has very few people working on European music, but almost all of the other Ivy League universities, and certainly my university, have reputable concentrations in European music. What we do find in America, in the US, is that students are not as interested in those fields. So it's hard to recruit students to do those, to study in those areas, and then to have those students find jobs. You know, I just had such wonderful students in 17th and 18th century studies who are finding work, but not at the level that we would have thought they would have deserved. So I do want to qualify and say, you know, if you look at any program from the last few years of the American Musicological Society, it sometimes sits uneasily. These sessions are so wildly different. But then I think if we begin to think of that as a strength and not a weakness, that we can work with that to present a wide range of areas in which there are, and to speak to the question about, and one that concerns us as well, are we losing the rigor of our disciplines and the rigor of our methodologies? Yes, I think we are in some ways. And in other ways, I think the rigor is simply shifting as the curricula shift, so that the rigor would not be focused on a century of European music, but it might be focused on organology, and you would go somewhere to study with a person who does organology, if that's, you know, if that's your interest, and that would be a center, but it would not extend across the wide spectrum of universities.
I think it might also be useful for you to know roughly the numbers of musicologists working in Italy. So if I'm correct, Giovanni helped me on this topic. In academia, we have 120 more or less positions open now as full professor and associate professor and senior and junior researchers. And I don't know about the conservatories, but I think we will not, if we sum the conservatory position to the academia, we will be around about 300, maybe less, musicologists working officially in the field. So numbers make a difference here also, because when you deal with your societies, you have great numbers, and so a larger stage for developing different interests, while here we are sort of compressed in a very limited positions, and that makes also and it's also true for graduate student programs here that are again run on with national competitions with very strict regulations to get in, and that makes also a difference. Michael, you were about asking.
Sure. I, in addition to what Georgia was saying, I would say that there's a lot of music theorists who are absolutely still working on European music. I did the mainstay of my work, especially the atonal work, was on European modernism. In my atonal theory classes, and I'll say that I'm now the one who teaches a lot of. We have several colleagues who teach atonal theory. I made it a point to teach for our advanced class nothing written before 2000. I decided the first semester of our curriculum is heavily modernist, and I wanted to deal with issues that go beyond pitch class, and I also wanted to diversify the range of composers I was doing. And when you just don't find a lot of women who are published composers in the early part of the century, and so starting at 2000 makes it very, very easy, especially for gender diversity. Ethnic diversity is a little harder, but I try to have a balance between European, Asian, American composers, particularly. I will also say that I still absolutely teach a Schenkerian analysis class. We may change the name of it to prolongational analysis, following a very smart recommendation from Chris Siegel in that issue of Journal of Schenkerian Studies that's become so problematic. That we don't refer to most other analytical forms with the name of a person. Neo-Riemannian theory, but that's not really Riemann. That's something that David Lewin kind of constructed, and a lot of people have worked on. So we don't refer to Roman numeral analysis as, I don't know, Weberian analysis or anything like that. I would also just say the musicology department at Harvard might be unfocused on European music. However, the music theory department at Harvard is Susanna Clark. Susie Clark has a great book on analyzing Schubert and has worked on medieval music. And Alex Redding, also, who does a lot of work with European music. So I plan to, this might be a good time for me to bring in Phil Ewell's work just a bit. Because that's certainly stirred up a lot of people, and I think that he raised some very good issues. But I also think that some people, and especially some younger scholars in the United States, are being very, very quick to say we shouldn't teach this anymore. This is racist methodology. It's a little bit like the problem that we have with Wagner. It's a little bit like the problem we have with terrible people. I don't think anybody has thought that Schenker was a nice guy for a long time. I mean, we've known well about his xenophobia. He certainly didn't see any value in Italian music, and we have known about. Well, just like I said, he's not somebody I would really want to have dinner with. But the methodology for me, where it's most valuable, is on the foreground level, and that's what I focus on primarily in my courses. Notions of voice leading and how it works. Notions of prolongation. I find, again, just me personally, the notion of the Ursatz to be a little bit metaphysical and a little bit too religious for me to ascribe to. So I also work on American musical theater, and a lot of songs go up. I've written a lot on the ascending line, and it's not always linear either. So I think that we can be informed, especially with the motion toward Italian partimenti theory and schema theory, the notion that there's not just this small number of backgrounds, that you can find a lot of different things when you look at this. And I would say that this answers one of the most pointed critiques that Phil Ewell made. That is that Schenker had made a comment metaphorically looking at just as there's a hierarchy of tones, there's a hierarchy of races. And I said this in a recent article on ornamentation in atonal music, where I talk about I readily hear in passing tones, neighbor tones, appoggiaturas in lyrical atonal music. Working on atonal music has come to make me realize that I don't really hear prolongation beyond a certain point in tonal music. And so that the studying one repertoire has made me think more critically about the other repertoire. I don't ascribe to that hierarchy of tones, which doesn't mean that I can't teach a good and fairly conservative class in prolongational analysis. But I do think that thinking about what Schenker says and what the kinds of claims he makes compared to what one actually believes about music is an important thing, and can lead to a continuation of a lot of traditional techniques and traditional repertoires.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I see a question from Giovanni.
Giovanni, please.
Three quick points. One is to remind the seminar that was organized by Cremona a few years ago, to which I had the pleasure to participate, on Orientalism with Kofi Agawu, Talia Pecker and Gian Mario, and it was really something that a discussion that I find now today in a new form, but that started back then. The second point that I want to stress is that this kind of encounters are really fruitful, because, and talking, since one of the purpose of this meeting was also to address or to talk to the graduate students, having done my experience to do the PhD in the United States, I must say that has been really formative for me, a very great experience in learning a different system, new ways of thinking, musicology and the society and the academic system. So just to encourage everyone that has this possibility to go and study abroad. And I think that I would encourage also the American to come to Europe to do, because this would be really a way to have some kind of real exchange in which not everyone comes to the monolithic thought of English-led civil rights ways, but to know different systems, different way of thinking. And I think that is really important, and I can testify this on my own, from my own experience. And a third very quick point to respond to Georgia's request about what we are doing. I can just now talk about ethnomusicology and just wrote down some of the conferences that we had in the past 2-3 years in ethnomusicologies, and just read the titles: Music Diasporas in the 21st Century, Ethnography of Recording Studios, How Europe Discovered Music of the World in the 1960s, Soundscape in the Age of Pandemics, Music of Oral Tradition as Heritage, Copyright and New Ethnographic Question.
Thank you, Gianmario. Giovanni. I elaborate on that, saying that maybe we should start talking about joint programs, joint doctoral programs between Europe and the US and North America. That a possible way of building bridges, and then exchanges, visiting professors, but also having a semester abroad, if not the whole program. I really had the same experience of Giovanni. I didn't go as a PhD student, I went as a postdoc, but really it was something that helped me a lot in shaping my interest in dealing with obstacles, in meeting great people and scholars. And I would say that quoting Alex Ross in Philip's work, we stick to the known in order to avoid the hard work of exploring the unknown. And this is really a mantra that we could keep reciting to ourselves, because sometimes the complexity of what we are doing has to do with the simple fact that we are used to read musicology in a way. We are used to not combining music theory. We are used not to think of jazz harmony as something that could be incorporated into the way that we teach tonal harmony. We are used to think that musical instruments are just objects that makes music, and then they're not so important for portraying the culture of a minority. And then we discovered that we can add complexity to what we already have in mind. So is anybody in the room
Can I be blunt and say,
Sure.
it would be really lovely to hear one of the students.
right?
Really important also.
I'll buy you a cocktail after if you.
You can even speak in Italian and we can translate for you.
Yep.
Right? Right.
Okay, even with alcohol, promise. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry.
Buy you a cocktail in New Orleans.
Yeah, well, by the way, I was in New Orleans 10 years ago, and it was the best experience ever. It was really a cultural turning point.
New Orleans is the place to come for cocktails.
Of course, yes, jumbo and Creole cuisine and all that kind of interesting stuff.
Well, while we're waiting for the students, I'd just like to respond to Max to say, of course, I love the idea of being in touch. I'm so grateful that you invited us here today, and it's really wonderful to hear from you. I have found over the years that European musicologists know the literature in English much better than we know the literature written by European musicologists. But when we do look at it, we are very impressed and realize that you have a different way of looking at music, but one that we can really learn from. And so I really do want to continue this connection and continue learning from what you're doing. And in Israel as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I think.
While we wait, I'm going to also put my email address in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
So if anybody wants to contact me with a question privately or talk, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could also organize sort of follow up. If you agree, I'll collect some questions and then we can share it in a more private moment. I mean, this has been quite challenging for all of us, and so I understand if there is no.
That would be great, and my email is in the chat. And Max, I'll be happy to send the PowerPoint to you,
Sure.
and you can distribute to your students if they're interested. And I do want to say, I want to echo Michael's offer that if anyone would like to get in touch and discuss American universities or anything about what I've said or American musicology, please feel free to do that anytime. I'll be alert to the email to look out for that.
Thank you. This is really precious to us. And you
I
both.
realized you sent it to me and not to everybody, Georgia, and then it auto-corrected your last name to spell it wrong. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me fix that.
It's a T, yes, of course.
Yes, it just
It's always happening. It's also happening to that. So you both guys have won a rain check, a real visit in Cremona as soon as possible with some real connection. But for now, thanks again for this wonderful morning/afternoon that we spent together. Thanks to Giovanni and thanks to the colleagues who were with us today. And thanks to everybody, and have a good aperitif.
Thank you.
If we
Thanks for inviting us to this.
Bye-bye.
Max, thank you. For
Thank you.
organizing. And nice to meet you.